Hi everyone, it's nice to be here today. My name is Gwilym Owen. I'm a research associate currently at the University of Liverpool for the last 3 weeks after being at Sheffield for the last 2 or 3 years. I am going to talk to you today about longitudinal analysis, which is something that I spend a lot of time doing in my own research. So, oh yeah, feel free to ask questions at any time, and we'll try and endeavour to answer them. So, what is longitudinal analysis? So the best definition that I could come up with was merging together a few different definitions that I read. Is analysis of data made up of repeated measurements of the same units of analysis over time. So what that means, for example, you might have data on health data on an individual at different stages, or on multiple individuals at different stages in their life course, and that would kind of essentially that is what that longitudinal data is. So why should I care about longitudinal analysis and longitudinal data? Well, kind of for the reasons that Andy talked about in the beginning. Basically, it allows you to ask richer sets of questions. It allows you to do a better analysis, because pretty simply, studying things that don't change is pretty boring, because everything changes really. And I guess also understanding processes across the whole life course is increasingly thought, or maybe has always been thought, to be important in understanding social and health outcomes. And maybe if you're not interested in individuals as such, if you're maybe interested in countries or something else, like studying how kind of the historical context is always really important, and yeah, can get you better answers to the same questions. Particularly if you're interested in what causes what, then it's pretty necessary to use longitudinal data. But it's not always sufficient. It's not the only thing you need. But if you don't know what happens before something else, the kind of temporal ordering of things, then that's very, very difficult to do. I guess the last point is lots of longitudinal data sets are now available. There's been a huge amount of investment to create huge numbers of data sets, particularly in the UK, but also in other countries too, to be able to study and to be able to answer these questions well. So there's lots of opportunities to perhaps ask new questions which may not have been possible before. So what kind of questions can you ask with longitudinal data? Well, perhaps you might want to just ask fairly descriptive questions. So what are the trends in mental health since the beginning of the pandemic? And you might want to know that for different social groups, for different age groups, or different people with different incomes, etc., etc. Other things you might want to do is follow trajectories as people age. So at what age do inequalities and obesity develop, maybe? Often in social sciences, we want to know does something cause something else, or does something lead to something else, or at least the things are two different variables associated. So you might want to know, do adverse childhood experiences lead to substance abuse later in life, or is rising income inequality within cities followed by rising residential segregation? Also, you might not know which way round your two variables go. So you might see a relationship between high debt in a country and low countries and low economic growth, but you don't know which way round it is. So with longitudinal data, you might be able to ask, does high debt lead to low economic growth, or is it the other way around? Other things you might be interested in. So often we think about the kind of average, but actually also the variation is often just as interesting. So we might want to look at whether variation within individuals in well-being, how is that greater than variation between individuals? Could be quite a very kind of important question to ask. And then there's other questions that you literally can't ask at all without longitudinal data. If you're interested in kind of mobility of any kind, is social mobility weaker than it was 50 years ago, for example, you could ask. But any question to do with mobility, spatial mobility or social mobility, you obviously need longitudinal data, because someone has to move from somewhere to somewhere else. And then finally, I'm not sure if I phrased this very well, but to what extent are older people more likely to vote Conservative because of their age, or is it because of the generation, the cohort they're from? So they're quite difficult questions to answer, but all sort of questions that require longitudinal data. So different types of longitudinal data. So mostly, if you hear the phrase longitudinal data, you're most likely people are considering individual level data. So things like cohort studies, and a cohort study is when you take a sample of a group of people who share a defining characteristic. I mean, the most common ones are kind of birth cohorts, where you follow. There's several in the UK where you follow individuals over time from early years, and maybe you sample them when they're born, in the first few months, after 2 years, after 5 years, after 10 years, after 18 years, and these can be either kind of prospective or retrospective. So you could take a cohort now and then look back in time, and if it's possible, and you could ask them about things that happened in the past, or collect other data. But often it's more useful to be able to do it the other way around, where you sample now and then you collect data as you go through time. So we have panel studies as well, which is very similar thing, but that normally refers to you're taking a sample of the whole population, and you're kind of following them over time. There's data linkage studies, where you might link lots of different types of data. So data on health, data on maybe hospital admissions. You could link that to people's education data, which is measured at different time points. And I've added, not necessarily always added, but I also added kind of like experimental data. Randomized trials are often by nature longitudinal. So for example, the vaccine trials for the COVID-19 vaccine, you will be measuring people into the future, essentially, as they record whether they get coronavirus or not. But I think it's also important to remember that longitudinal data is not just about individuals. So if you're interested in other units of analysis in countries, cities, neighborhoods, schools, businesses, hospitals, I'm sure there's many more things, you can also have longitudinal data on this. So for example, you could even things like repeated cross-sectional surveys or time series of multiple countries can be longitudinal at the country level. So even if you such as some of the European social surveys, you survey a cross-section of each country every year or every 2 years. It might not be longitudinal at the individual level, but you still have longitudinal data at the country level. So just a few longitudinal studies in the UK. So I'm not quite sure how far through PhD people are, but kind of ideas of what kind of data that you might be able to use. So in the top right, we have Understanding Society, the UK Household Longitudinal Study, which is a huge study of 40,000 households, I think. And they're asked a whole load of questions each year, and so we can try and understand how society progresses. But if you're interested in maybe particularly older people, there's the English Longitudinal Study of Aging. Or if you're interested in young people, the Children of the 90s, which also known as Ausback, which is they recorded every child born in 1990 in the Bristol area and followed them over time. Child of the New Century, otherwise known as the Millennium Cohort Study, is they took a UK representative sample of the population of children born in 2000, and they followed them over time. So of course they're now just moving into adulthood. I guess they're now university students. And also in the middle, there's the Scottish Longitudinal Study, which is more of a kind of data linkage study. So that it links. There's one in England and one in Wales as well, and that links the census data with people with a range of other data on individuals. On kind of, you can link it to administrative health data and stuff like that. So a range of things that you might be like, oh, this might be useful for the questions that I want to answer. Very UK centric, but if you're interested in other countries, the UK does have a very good data infrastructure, but other countries you'd probably be able to find similar type of things. So kind of how might we model we get this data? So this is a very very simple example of two people. So looking at how happiness changes over time, I don't know, we might be interested in after lockdown, what happened to people's self-reported happiness or well-being. And we might measure it each month or something like that. I'm not sure if this is probably not what would have happened, but we have two people here. One, and you can see that one person, just by plotting the data, which is the first thing that you should always do, you can see that there are quite different trajectories between the two different individuals. So if we were just doing a sort of a simple linear regression between time and happiness, we would come up with this relationship that we have here, which is kind of fine, but also that there's kind of issues with if we just did this as our analysis. Kind of technically, the residuals in our model are related, so we're kind of autocorrelated. So we're violating some of the assumptions of our model, but also at the same time, this model isn't particularly interesting. We're finding the average trend, but actually, what would be more interesting is to look at the average trend, and then then we can create a kind of line or a trajectory for each individual. And so we can, and these lines don't have to be parallel. We can look at different individuals and give them different slopes. And then this allows us to look at the kind of variation between individuals, which is between the different colored lines, and the variation within individuals, which is the differences between the dot and the line around that. So this is the sort of kind of framework. It's very similar if you took Andy's course on multi-level modeling. It's essentially that we're essentially doing the same thing. We have two levels in our data. We have the individual observations nested inside each individual person. And again, it doesn't have to be individual people. This could be time points within countries. Okay, speed up. Yeah, we don't have to have linear relationships. This might be a more realistic thing to what would happen as a response to lockdown. We might see that some people, everyone gets less happy at the beginning, but then some people recover a lot quicker. We might want to try and explain that. The people who are on the red line, maybe that type of person is maybe quite an affluent person who it's not affected so much as someone living in a deprived area. So we might introduce explanatory characteristics. I tried to find someone who's actually done this, and the models are slightly more complicated, but they looked at how differences in the trajectory and mental health. So this is on the y-axis. We have anxiety and how it's decreased over time during the pandemic, but it's decreased more for certain groups. Other things that we might want to do. So we might want to look at the relationship between two variables within and between countries. So this is looking at on the x-axis is looking at GDP per capita, and on the y-axis it's looking at satisfaction. And then you can clearly see the overall trend between countries, but often we want to know what's going on within countries, and because that in some ways that can often be more important. I think like my time is up. So just quickly about the course, we'll be using R. We will be mainly focusing on panel data, so data with large numbers of observations and small numbers of time points. The prerequisites is a basic knowledge of R and a knowledge of linear regression. So basically, there's a lot of jargon in terms of what exactly we're going to do, looking at random mixed effects models for continuous and discrete responses, and kind of growth curve models, which is effectively the same thing. fixed effects models, and we'll quickly have a look at survival models, which is which is looking at a specific event happens and how long it takes for that event to happen, and kind of comparisons between groups. But essentially, that's a lot of jargon. Essentially, what we're going to do is learn how to model longitudinal data and answer some of the research questions that I suggested, or at least show you how you might start to think about going on to answer these questions.